story of Assyria begins with a verse, immortalized by Lord Byron, of an empire whose very name inspired both fear and fascination. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. From humble beginnings as a small city-state on the banks of the Tigris, Assyria would rise to command the ancient Near East, inventing the machinery of empire. Professional armies drilled to precision, relay posts and royal roads that carried orders faster than rumor, and a lattice of governors and auditors that could turn distant conquest into daily obedience. In a world of clay and river reed, they engineered something new, rule at scale. An operating system that later powers from Persia and Rome to the Ottomans would adapt in their own tongues. But Assyria was never merely steel and statutes. It was conviction. In the shadow of ziggurats and under the winged gaze of Lamassu, kings styled themselves the agents of Ashur, charged not simply to win but to order the world, to push roads through wilderness, to tame rivers with embankments, to bind cities by scribes and seals. Its capitals, Assur, then Nimrud, then Dur-Sharakin, then Nineveh, were manifestos in brick, each a new thesis about how holiness and sovereignty should share a skyline. It is also a tale of terrible clarity. Assyrian annals gleam with tribute and victories, and drip with the theater of terror. Walls crowned in impaled rebels, cities broken by rams and fire, deported peoples resettled by imperial design. And yet in the very palaces where reliefs show lions bleeding into the dust, libraries rose, a universe of tablets where epics and omens were copied for safekeeping. The same hand that drew the bow preserved Gilgamesh. In the end, the wolf too would be hunted. Coalitions hardened, margins rebelled, and Nineveh's gardens went to ash. The empire fell, first in a season of sieges, then in centuries of forgetting. Its roads scoured, its script silenced to scholars' shelves. But Assyria did not vanish. It endured as a habit of power, and a habit of mind. In the voices of Aramaic and Syriac, in churches lifting hymns where once courtiers lifted libations, in the stubborn memory of a people who learned to live without a crown. This is the arc we follow, from a riverside town that called its god king, to an engine of dominion that taught the world how empires are made, from Lamassu flanked gates to smoking ruins, from terror to tablet, from fall to afterlife. Assyria's story is the blueprint and the warning, the architecture of control, and the price of believing that order must always expand. The earliest flickers of Assyrian identity take us back more than 4,000 years. Around 2600 BC, the city of Assur emerged on the middle course of the Tigris River. It was not yet a mighty capital, nor even independent, rather a provincial settlement within larger Mesopotamian realms like Akkad and the Third Dynasty of Ur. Assur's first inhabitants were Semitic peoples, whose ancestors had migrated northward from the Arabian Peninsula when climate change turned lush savanna into desert. Settling in the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, these Semites mingled with the older Sumerians, adopting their cuneiform writing, religious traditions, and urban organization. For centuries, Assur remained overshadowed by southern powerhouses, Sargon of Akkad's empire, and later Ur's dynasty. The city's rulers were not kings in their own right, but mere governors, Ishiaks, ruling in the name of the city's god Ashur. The deity Ashur was more than just a god. He was the living embodiment of the city itself. Archaeological evidence shows that early Assur was already a religious center, with temples dedicated to Ishtar and Ashur. Yet militarily it was weak, its population numbering perhaps 10,000 at most. The people relied more on trade than conquest. Merchants carried tin, textiles, and copper to Anatolia, where Assyrian trading colonies like Karum-Kanesh thrived. In return, they brought timber, silver, and gold, goods scarce in Mesopotamia. But this prosperity was fragile. As larger empires collapsed around 2025 BC, the Third Dynasty of Ur crumbled under pressure from nomadic Amorites and Elamites. Out of the chaos, Assur at last gained independence. A man named Puzur-Ashur I is remembered as the founder of a new dynasty, the first to rule in Assyria free from southern domination. This marks the dawn of the Old Assyrian period. Assur's independence in the early 2nd millennium BC did not transform it overnight into a conquering empire. Instead, it remained a merchant republic with oligarchic tendencies. The god Ashur was the true king, while human rulers acted only as his stewards. Power was balanced between the ruler, a council of elders, and an elected official called the Limu, who gave his name to each year. This period is most famous for Assur's long-distance trade network. Merchants traveled hundreds of kilometers to establish colonies in Anatolia. At Kultepe, or ancient Kanesh, archaeologists have discovered more than 22,000 clay tablets, the archives of Assyrian merchants. These tablets record everything from contracts and loans to personal letters. They reveal an advanced economy where private citizens, not the state, drove commerce. The old Assyrian trade system was unique. Tin and textiles flowed north from Assur. Silver and gold flowed south from Anatolia. And merchants operated in small family companies, pooling resources and splitting profits. This mercantile wealth gave Assur influence disproportionate to its size. Yet it remained a city-state, vulnerable to greater powers. Around 1808 BC, Assur fell to the Amorite conqueror, Shamshi-Adad I, who created a short-lived kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia. Shamshi-Adad styled himself king of the universe, but his empire collapsed soon after his death. For the next few centuries, Assur's fate was uncertain. At times it was independent. At others, it was dominated by Babylonia, Eshnunna, or Mitanni. By the 15th century BC, Assur had even become a vassal of the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. Its walls were torn down, its independence stifled, and foreign officials sat on its council. And yet, the Assyrians endured. From their neighbors they learned new technologies: the composite bow, the light war chariot, and lamellar armor. These innovations would later make them deadly foes. By the mid-14th century BC, the Mitanni kingdom weakened under Hittite pressure. Into this power vacuum stepped Ashur-uballit I. He rebuilt Assur's walls, expelled foreign envoys, declared himself king of the land of Ashur, and launched Assyria's first true conquests. This was the birth of the Middle Assyrian Empire. When Ashur-uballit I stepped onto the stage, Assyria ceased to be simply the city of Ashur and became Mat Ashur, the land of Ashur. The shift was more than a title. It was a transformation in identity. If earlier rulers had been governors on behalf of the god, Ashur-uballit declared something bolder. The Assyrian king was the human instrument of a divine mandate to rule. This new self-understanding collided with a changing geopolitical map. The Hittites had shattered the old Mitanni order. Kassite Babylonia eyed the north with suspicion. The Egyptians watched from afar. In letters to foreign courts, Ashur-uballit insisted on the dignity of Assyria, styling himself a great king among equals, no longer a client to be dismissed by Babylonian scribes. He married diplomacy with steel, fortifying Assur and seizing nearby lands that had once only been way stations on trade routes. The reformed state needed a reformed administration. The Limu office, once a civic honorific tied to merchant oligarchy, survived mostly as a chronological marker. Real executive energy flowed from the palace into a growing grid of provinces with governors. Each province funneled goods, labor, and soldiers through annual inspections and audits. The temples remained immensely prestigious, but they were now anchored firmly within a royal order. Offerings and temple estates increasingly depended on royal patronage and oversight. Assyrian ideology grew in ambition. The king was still the shepherd of his people, Reu, the caretaker, but also Mokultemi, the establisher of order, charged to extend the just scepter of Ashur. In this worldview, Assyria was cosmos, the realm of right worship and right order. Beyond its borders was chaos, not ethnically inferior but ritually disordered, politically unstable, a threat to the harmony the gods intended. Expansion thus became a moral duty. From Adad-nirari I through Shalmaneser I and Tukulti-Ninurta I, Middle Assyria matured into a regional hegemon. These kings carved away the last vestiges of Mitanni power, imposed vassalage deep into northern Mesopotamia, and repeatedly battered Babylon when it opposed Assyrian designs. The army, still composed mostly of levies, was reorganized with clearer specialization. Archers, slingers, shield-bearers, and charioteers who trained enough to act as quasi-professionals. The chariot, sleek and fast, offered shock and mobility. Composite bows gave killing reach. Lamellar armor, layered scales of leather and bronze, gave protection without crippling weight. But the real revolution was logistical. The palace did not merely hoard wealth, it channeled production. Provincial storehouses supplied the army in seasonal campaigns. Corvée labor built roads, canals, and fortresses, knitting conquered terrain to Assur's beating heart. Annual musters became routine. The king marched with spring, and with autumn returned hosts laden with tribute, timber, metals, horses, and captives destined to be artisans, laborers, or settlers in newly subdued districts. At its zenith under Tukulti-Ninurta I, Middle Assyria aimed even higher. After defeating the Hittites at Nihria and humiliating Babylonia, Tukulti-Ninurta took a step as audacious as any conqueror before him. He founded a new capital, Kar Tukulti-Ninurta, across the Tigris from Assur. This was more than palace vanity. It rearranged the sacred geography. The royal palace dominated temple precincts. The architectural language declared that the king's court was now the axis of the world, a bold inversion of older Assur, where temples had dwarfed palaces. Here we glimpse a pattern that will repeat: Assyrian capitals as manifestos. They are not merely residences. They are visual constitutions, stone-carved arguments about where legitimacy lies. Yet the Middle Assyrian engine had vulnerabilities. After Tukulti-Ninurta's assassination, the empire's reach slackened. The late Bronze Age collapse, a swirl of migrations, climate shocks, and systemic breakdown, gnawed at roads, trade, and provincial control. The Assyrian heartland, Nineveh, Assur, Arbela, endured, defended as much by distance and rugged terrain as by arms. But for 2 centuries, Assyria shrank inward, its kings fighting hard to preserve the core. Then, from that humbled core, a new reconquista began. When Ashur-dan II and his successors took the field in the early 9th century BC, they marched with a memory, the borders their ancestors had drawn with sweat and blood. The task was not invention but restoration, to retake what had been Assyria's and impose once more the order of Ashur. That the project succeeded from such reduced beginnings is one of the great strategic feats of the ancient world. The kings of the 9th till 7th centuries BC built an empire that was administratively deeper, militarily harder, and ideologically clearer than anything before. If Middle Assyria had pioneered provincial rule, Neo-Assyria hardened it into a machine. Gears meshing from palace to hamlet, from royal annals to village tax tallies. Ashur-Nasirpal II was the lightning before the storm. He marched to the Mediterranean, took tribute from Phoenician cities, and filled his annals with chilling terror theater. Towers of heads, walls lined with impaled rebels. The cruelty wasn't senseless. It was policy. A reputation for horror saved campaigns that legions would otherwise have had to fight, breaking wills before sieges ever began. At home, Ashur-Nasirpal did something just as consequential. He moved the capital to a refurbished Nimrud in 879 BC. Palaces soared above temples. Lamassu, human-headed bulls with wings, guarded gateways, embodiments of power and protection. Reliefs unfurled like stone tapestries. Kings hunting lions, armies crossing rivers, genies fertilizing sacred trees. If the Middle Assyrian state had argued that the palace now eclipsed the temple, Nimrud proclaimed it with a roaring visual grammar. Shalmaneser III followed with 40 years of campaigning, battering Urartu in the north and crushing coalitions in Syria. Yet his long reign closed with court factions rising, the age of the magnates. Provincial lords, generals, and palace officers amassed estates and personal armies. The machine needed recalibration. This came in the name of Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to power in a coup and then proceeded to re-engineer the empire. His genius lay not only in generalship, but in institutional design. He created effectively the first professional army in the Near East, recruiting landless peasants and equipping them from the state armory. Training became routine. Discipline became doctrine. He subdivided provinces so that no governor controlled excessive resources. Eunuchs, loyal and without heirs, were promoted to the highest commands to short-circuit dynastic threats. He tightened taxation and corvée labor, ensuring steady supplies for year-round campaigning. And last but not least, he introduced and routinized mass deportations, the policy of Nahu, or uprooting. Populations from rebellious zones were resettled, their local elites dispersed, and in their place arrived people from elsewhere. The intent was to break the link between land, lineage, and resistance, and it worked, at least for a time. Strategically, Tiglath-Pileser exploded Assyria's footprint. Damascus fell, Israel and Judah became client states, Philistia was subdued up to Egypt's border, and Babylonia was taken under direct control. He crowned himself king of Babylon in 729 BC, adopting the time-worn southern titles, king of Sumer and Akkad, in a gesture that fused prestige with policy. The empire was no longer a chain of tributary kings. It was a territorial state with Assyrian garrisons and governors embedded within it. Behind the army marched another weapon, the royal post. Along routes carved and paved across valleys and deserts, mounted couriers carried tablets and letters between governors and court. Messages could cross hundreds of kilometers in days, a speed that would not be surpassed in the region until the telegraph. Orders could be issued, audited, and enforced. The empire did not just conquer, it communicated. Sargon II consolidated the gains, crushed Samaria, and then made a startling move. He built Dur-Sharrukin, Sargon's fortress, and made it his capital. Unlike Nimrud, planted on an ancient site, Dur-Sharrukin rose de novo from the plain, a cosmic diagram in brick and alabaster. Its walls traced ideology, royal apartments, administrative courts, temples tuned to celestial alignments, monumental gates where Lamassu watched the horizons. If Nimrud had said the king towered over inherited sanctities, Dur-Sharrukin declared the king creates the world anew. When Sargon died in battle, his son Sennacherib abandoned Dur-Sharrukin and poured resources into Nineveh, expanding it into a metropolis of canals, gardens, and palaces. In some tales, the legendary Hanging Gardens may have stood here. Sennacherib's reliefs read like graphic novels. Battering rams chew city walls. Infantry advance beneath wicker shields. Engineers divert rivers and span them with causeways. Militarily, the Neo-Assyrian army had transformed. Cavalry, once a courier arm, now fought as mounted archers and lancers, precursors of later cataphracts. Iron flowed through the empire, iron spearheads, iron helmets, iron scales, tempered in provincial forges and shipped via river fleets to the mustering grounds. Siegecraft matured into science. Sappers tunneled under walls. Siege towers pushed archers above parapets. Battering rams with metal-shod heads smashed gates while crews inside protected housings doused fires with water skins. Where earlier kingdoms waited months for famine, Assyria assaulted and took. Under Esarhaddon, Assyria achieved what had long been the horizon. Egypt fell to Assyrian spear points. In proclamations, Esarhaddon became king of the universe and king of the four quarters, titles older than empire itself. Assyrian governors now watched the Nile Delta, while Phoenician ports supplied timber and silver, and caravans from Arabia brought incense and aromatics to the great markets of the north. His son, Ashurbanipal, embodied the empire's paradox, a king both lion hunter and librarian. On reliefs, he draws a bow against a charging lion. In his palace, scribes collect and copy tens of thousands of tablets. The library of Ashurbanipal was not an antiquarian hobby. It was statecraft, divination, medicine, ritual, literature. To govern was to know, to order the present by mastering the past. Because the Assyrians collected and copied so much, we possess the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and other treasures of Mesopotamian literature. Yet the machine hummed at a cost. Deportations mingled peoples and spread Aramaic, the easy, adaptable Semitic lingua franca, until it was not only the empire's working language, but increasingly the language of the Assyrian heartland itself. Akkadian, in its Assyrian and Babylonian dialects, persisted in royal inscriptions and scholarship, but on leather scrolls and papyrus, in market stalls and way stations, Aramaic flowed like water. Assyria did not seek to impose one tongue. It sought to impose obedience. Language followed trade, and trade followed roads. From Ashurnasirpal onward, terror had served as policy. It shattered resistance in advance, cowed the undecided, and made examples of stubborn cities. But terror cuts two ways. Fear deters, and it festers. By the later 10th century, almost every neighbor nursed a memory of grievance, a ledger of burned towns and flayed nobles. When Assyria weakened within, that memory caught fire. The spark was the old Babylonian problem. However often Assyrian kings honored Marduk or rebuilt Babylon's temples, rule from Nineveh sat uneasily in the south. After Ashurbanipal, the succession faltered. Court factions and provincial strongmen maneuvered. The empire had always required motion, annual campaigns, the ritual of the king in the field. When motion stuttered, margins frayed. Into this widening gyre rode new horsemen from the east, Medes, alongside a resurgent Babylon under Nabopolassar. When coalitions that had once melted before Assyrian arms now held together, the empire found itself overextended. In 614 BC, Assur, the holy city, fell and was sacked. In 612, after a 3-month siege, Nineveh was stormed. Reliefs were ripped from walls, the palace libraries crushed into mud. The last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit-thatu, fought on from Haran with Egyptian help. But in 609 BC, his army was broken. The wolf that had once descended on 1,000 flocks vanished from the plain. And yet, this is not the end of the Assyrian story. It is the end of Assyrian statehood, not of Assyrian people or culture. When the Medo-Babylonian coalition unmade Assyria, they did not erase it. Cities lay empty and charred. The Neo-Babylonian kings invested little in rebuilding the northern heartland. Akkadian, the old tongue of kings and scribes, faded from speech. But Aramaic, already the empire's bloodstream, carried fragments of Assyria forward. Names, customs, memories. Under the Achaemenid Persians, the region became Athura, a satrapy whose very name echoed Ashur. Persian kings, pragmatists in governance, allowed local cults to breathe. The statue of Ashur returned to Assur, and temples flickered back to life. A plateau of recovery followed beneath the Seleucids. Assur, Nimrud, and Nineveh saw resettlement. Villages multiplied on river terraces. Under the Parthians, the north entered a renaissance. Client kingdoms, Osroene, Adiabene, Hatra, sprawled over the old provincial grid. In Assur itself, local rulers erected stelae in a conscious imitation of Neo-Assyrian royal art. It was as if the past reached across the centuries to teach its script anew. For a time, roughly the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, the density of settlements in the Assyrian heartland rivaled that of the empire's peak. The Ashur temple was restored. The cult calendar observed rites familiar to Ashurbanipal's priests 8 centuries earlier. In this twilight of antiquity, identities mixed. Greek gods syncretized with Mesopotamian ones. In Adiabene, a royal house even converted to Judaism. Then came the Sasanian storm. Around AD 240, Assur was sacked again. The Ashur temple destroyed. Populations scattered. The old religion, sometimes called Asherism by moderns, lingered in pockets. Haran's Sabians down to the 10th century, Mardin's Shamsiya perhaps into the 18th. But everywhere Christianity rose, sung and read in Syriac, a literary form of Aramaic. One might think that with the fall of empire and the loss of Akkadian speech, Assyria dissolved into dust. The reality is stranger, subtler, and more enduring. Ethnicity in the ancient Near East seldom mapped to modern categories. What made one Assyrian was less phenotypic boundary than political belonging, ritual obligation, and loyalty to the king who served Ashur. After the fall, those civic markers faded, but communities remained in the land, bearing names and customs that remembered. Aramaic carried that memory forward. In late antiquity and the medieval world, Syriac writers often described themselves as Suryaye or Suryoyo, terms linguistically entwined with Assurayu. The words Syria and Assyria, ultimately from Ashur, drifted in and out of each other across Greek and local usage. Self-designations varied by century, place, and context. The biblical image of Assyria as Israel's enemy made Assyrian a contested label in Christian texts, even as Assyria and its kings remained vivid features of regional folklore and historical consciousness. By the 19th century, amid persecution and revival, a modern Assyrian national awakening tied identity explicitly back to the ancient empire. Today, Assyrian communities, speaking modern Neo-Aramaic dialects, often called Assyrian, Surith, or Surite, trace a line of cultural continuity rather than unbroken statehood or language. That continuity is visible in liturgies, toponyms, festivals like Akitu reborn as cultural heritage, and in the tenacity of a people who have weathered the Sappho genocide, dispersion, and the depredations of modern war. If Assyria's kings vanished, Assyria's solutions did not. Later empires borrowed Assyria's tools as if from a statecraft armory. Provincial administration with layered oversight and audits, royal roads and relay posts, the nerve system of empire, standing forces supplemented by specialized arms from cavalry to engineers, annual campaigning cycles, planned logistics, and siege doctrine, annals and archives as instruments of rule, knowledge not merely recorded but curated for governance. The Persians systematized the satrapy. The Romans perfected roads and siegecraft. Islamic empires later wove postal relays into vast realms. Yet behind these legacies is the early clarity of an Assyrian insight. An empire is not only conquest, it is communication, it is administration, it is story. The myth a state tells about itself, incised in stone and carried by couriers from the frontier to the throne. Across the centuries, Assyria's army moved from citizen levies to a professional corps, the Kisir Shari, around which swirled seasonal contingents and subject troops. Chariots ceded primacy to cavalry, iron transformed kit. Engineers turned sieges into predictable operations rather than wagers on famine. The empire could move fast, strike hard, and sustain pressure through logistics that reached from storehouses to river fleets to desert wells dug in advance of invasion. Just as crucial was the postal intelligence lattice. Governors and generals sent near real-time reports. Omens were read by scholars, umani, who advised on campaigns, and the palace archived both victories and nightmares. When Ashurbanipal's scribes copied ancient epics beside omen series and pharmacopoeias, they weren't indulging nostalgia. They were building decision support systems with clay tablets and memory. The theology that matured from the Old to the Neo-Assyrian period is stark in its simplicity. Ashur, once perhaps a deified city, becomes in ideology king of the gods. The Assyrian king is his viceroy, commanded to broaden the land of Ashur and subdue chaos beyond. Conquest is not greed, it is obedience. Resistance is not politics, it is blasphemy against cosmic order. This theology empowered extraordinary mobilization. It also blinkered statecraft. A world framed as order versus chaos can become unable to compromise, and as margins harden into enemies, coalitions form. Assyria's greatest victories and its final catastrophe are both children of this iron logic. The Assyrian Empire died not once but several times, in 612, in 609, again in AD 240, then in the fires of the 14th century and in massacres of the 20th. And yet the Assyrian story did not end. Its capitals are sand and shard, its language a scholar's discipline. If you stand where the Tigris bends and the wind moves across the Tell, you can still imagine the royal road running straight as a thrown spear toward the horizon. Along it thundered chariots and couriers, post-riders and envoys, engineers and kings. Along it too traveled stories, of terror and law, of gardens and libraries, of the stubborn belief that the world could be ordered from a single heart.